Julia Manchester joins me now from Washington. She's a political reporter for The Hill. So, Julia, for the first time on Wednesday, former Vice President Joe Biden made a direct call for the impeachment of President Trump. Why is he finally taking a more aggressive approach?
Elena, is very interesting, the kind of range of events we've seen leading up to this. You know, at first, Joe Biden was very cautious to call for impeachment. Then he came out in favor of the impeachment inquiry, and now he's saying he needs to be impeached. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that Joe Biden and his son Hunter are at the center of this. This all is about the president's calls to investigate them and their ties to this Ukrainian prosecutor and Hunter Biden's role on the Ukrainian energy company Burisma. So I think this is Joe Biden essentially very much fighting back and defending himself. And I think his campaign, as well as a number of other Democrats, have been able to take cover by a number of public opinion polls showing that Americans are moving more towards favoring an impeachment inquiry, or in some cases, impeachment. This is Joe Biden trying to come out very forcefully, and I think it will absolutely help him with his Democratic base. You know, one thing that Democratic candidates and Democratic voters in general have in common is that Donald Trump is their #1 enemy. So you're going to see them very much uniting around these calls for impeachment. The question is whether these calls for impeachment, how those will fly in the general election after the Democratic primary wraps up next year.
Well, the former vice president's son announced that he will step down from the board of a Chinese-backed equity firm. In a statement on Sunday, Biden's attorney released a statement that reads in part, quote, "Under a Biden administration, Hunter will readily comply with any and all guidelines or standards a President Biden may issue to address purported conflicts of interest. In any event, Hunter will agree not to serve on boards of or work on behalf of foreign-owned companies." So, Julia, tell us more about what was addressed in this statement.
You know, in that statement, I think this is essentially the Biden family, Hunter Biden in particular, covering him and his father in the case that his father is elected president. You know that Republicans during the, throughout this week, including President Trump, have been putting a lot of pressure on Hunter Biden. You've been hearing questions as to where is Hunter Biden? When is he going to speak out? And this is essentially him breaking his silence. And you know that if Vice President Biden were to be elected president, Republicans in the House or the Senate, just congressional Republicans, would absolutely vow to continue these investigations into the Bidens. We've seen how they have done it with the Clintons, and I don't think they would stop necessarily there. And I think this is a good campaign move in order for Biden to be able to put this to rest. Remember, Joe Biden doesn't want to be focused on this throughout the presidential campaign. And I think Hunter Biden's role in all of this, no matter what side of this issue you really stand on, his role on this energy company and this entire scenario doesn't necessarily, I don't think, fly well with a number of Americans. I think a lot of Americans see this as very swampy, very elitist. So this is a way for Hunter Biden to be able to put this to rest and allow his father to continue to talk about issues such as healthcare and the economy, and very much push those kitchen table issues home ahead of the election.
Well, was this an inevitable step for someone in his position to take, or does this legitimize the president's attacks on his family?
I think it was actually very inevitable that this would happen. You've seen that this is kind of a pattern of the Biden campaign. They've been slow well, they haven't been slow, but they've come out, they've addressed the issue, and then they have moved on. And I think this is Hunter trying to do that as well. Like I said before, the president and other Republicans were ratcheting up the pressure on Hunter Biden this week. So I think this is his way of addressing the question and allowing his father to move on. Remember, there is a Democratic debate next week, and I would imagine that Joe Biden could be asked about this. This will also be the first Democratic debate where the issue of impeachment has come up, ever since Nancy Pelosi called for a formal impeachment inquiry. So I would imagine that Joe Biden inevitably would be brought into that conversation on the debate stage. So now with this statement out from his son, it does provide him with some cover and allow him to kind of say, look, this is how this would play out if I was elected president.
Well, keeping with 2029, Democratic presidential candidates took part in a CNN human rights campaign town hall this week. They focused on a number of key issues related to LGBTQ rights. Julia, what did their messages tell us about where the Democratic Party now stands when it comes to these issues?
Well, Elaine, it was really interesting because looking at this issue of LGBTQ rights, and obviously it's a very broad issue, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of Americans is, oh, Democrats are most likely on the same page. They want to pass the Equality Act. They want to, obviously expand rights for LGBTQ individuals. However, there was a divide that we saw on stage, and that was mainly between Senator Cory Booker and former Congressman Beto O'Rourke. When asked whether religious organizations such as churches should lose their tax-exempt statuses if they oppose gay marriage, Beto O'Rourke said that they absolutely should. He did not skip a beat, whereas Cory Booker didn't necessarily answer the question. He kind of danced around that question. So I think that's kind of exposing a larger divide within the Democratic Party and could very much bring up a lot of conversation among religious Democrats as well as to where this goes forward. And I think other Democratic candidates will have to answer to that question. And that question in particular for Democrats and lots of Americans is very touchy.
Well, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders suffered a heart attack more than a week ago. He's out of the hospital and he says on the mend, but his campaign is now facing questions over his age and viability as a presidential candidate. How is Senator Sanders tackling those concerns over his health?
Right, so we've seen Senator Sanders do a couple of different interviews this week, and the main message he's been saying is, look, I'm resting up. He didn't go to that town hall, the CNN LGBTQ Human Rights Campaign town hall last week. He's at home in Burlington. However, he will be at the debate next week. But the general message you're hearing is, I'm going to start scaling back my campaign events, but I'm still very focused on this. And he's also adding the caveat of, I was not smart to not pay attention to my symptoms, and he's very much trying to use this as an example as to why people should be paying attention to their health symptoms, to their, just listening to their bodies, if you will. However, there's a lot of questions because even if he does scale back his campaign, he's one of the most active presidential candidates out there right now. I mean, he's holding multiple rallies a week, and that's a lot of hard work. So there's questions as to whether, how that will impact his campaign without him on the trail as much, and whether people who are older than the age of 75 are really in shape or are able to run for president. We saw that former President Jimmy Carter a couple of weeks ago. He's 95 now, but he said he doesn't necessarily think people should be running for president if they're over the age of 80 or approaching that age. So it's definitely opening up a new conversation and putting the Sanders campaign on the hot seat.
Finally, Julia, in Louisiana, Governor John Bel Edwards failed to secure a second term on Saturday. Edwards fell shy of the 50% support he needed to win a second term outright. He is now headed for a runoff election in November against Republican Eddie Rispone. Explain to us why this particular race is significant.
It's very significant because Louisiana has traditionally been a red state. However, it has been a red state, and we've seen that there's been some of a Democratic comeback with John Bel Edwards. However, we're seeing Republicans really start to make inroads again and making this very highly competitive. So I think it just does show how competitive the southeastern portion of the United States is, and where a lot of the resources from the national committees and resources from national politicians are going to be going into this state race. We've already seen President Trump tweet about this race last night, so it's going to be something that a lot of Americans are going to be paying attention to.
All right, Julia Manchester in Washington for us. Julia, thank you very much.
Thank you.